All right, thank you for having me. And I will say the Lovecraft book is now out, so if you want to order as many copies as you want, you're fully capable of doing so. So in Albert Bigelow Paine's 1912 biography of Twain, he has the quote that's kind of become famous now from Twain saying, "I came in with Halley's comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it. It will be the greatest disappointment of my life if I don't go out with Halley's comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt, now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together, they must go out together." And actually, if you look at the two arrivals of Halley's comet in 1835 and 1910, they actually do kind of follow a similar parallel trajectory to Twain's life. When Halley's comet arrived in 1835, the search for it began in late 1834. It wasn't spotted until August 13th, 1835 at Yale. So again, a little Connecticut connection there. Its closest approach to the sun was only around 3 months later. So again, it's not really seen until it comes very close to Earth. Writing in 1910, the astronomer E.E. Bernard pointed out that in contrast to 1910, the 1835 passage, there's very little fanfare about it. It's almost kind of, come and gone. So not very well known. You could argue just like Mark Twain being born in 1835, not many people took much account of his birth. By the time he dies in 1910, of course, he's a major celebrity, and the Halley's Comet passage of 1910 similarly is a much bigger deal than in 1835. In the 1910 passage, the observation or the attempts to find it start 2 years early. Barnard, the astronomer I mentioned, starts the search for it in 1908. It's first observed by German astronomers in 1909, but it only becomes visible from Earth after circling the sun and coming out the other side in April 1910. Its closest passage next to Earth is May 6, right after Mark Twain had died. And then in between, Mark Twain had written a few comet-related stories. But beyond that as well, there's also the fact that he has a general interest in astronomy, which doesn't always come out in his fiction, but if you read his biographies, some of his letters, it's very clear that he's very interested in reading on matters of astronomy. So I'll touch on just a few things, not only of his interest, but of astronomical developments in the wider world of his time. And I'll start by saying that, of course, we're going to talk about Mark Twain and Halley's Comet, talk a little bit about Halley itself and his comet. Halley's Comet, if you go back, you can see it's been recorded, I think, since at least the 3rd century BCE. There's Babylonian and Chinese depictions of it. One of the kind of earliest passages that's recorded in what we would call Western sources is 12 BCE. And later on, it passes repeatedly in 1301. The passage happens when Giotto is painting his famous depiction of the Nativity. He bases the Star of Bethlehem on Halley's Comet because it had been passing it that year. Edmund Halley himself, he observes the comet's 1682 passage. He looks back through history and he finds that there's comets that have been recurring relatively frequently between 74 and 76 years, mainly because every time Halley's Comet comes into the inner solar system, Jupiter's gravity alters its course somewhat. So it's not a precise orbit, but between 74, 76 years. So Halley thinks, okay, if this is happening, then the next comet's passage should be in the year 1758. When the comet does indeed return, that's the time that comes before the 1835 arrival. That's when it's called Halley's Comet. That's also when people start planning, backwards by approximately 74 years, and they think maybe it had been the Star of Bethlehem. Later on, that gets revised, and the date of that nearest passage, 12 BCE, not really accepted anymore that it was the Star of Bethlehem, but that's the speculation that would have been around when Mark Twain was living. And you can imagine, as someone with a skeptical view of religion, you probably would appreciate that a humoristic view. Now, another kind of interesting passage of Halley's Comet, it came by in the year 530 CE. In a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, Hank Morgan is sent back to the year 528. He stays there for a decade. It's very interesting, therefore, that Twain didn't include the passage of Halley's Comet in a Connecticut Yankee. I don't know why, but it's a missed opportunity for Twain. Should be chided for that. Now, again, during Twain's life, a major development, the Civil War in the United States. Comets, and since antiquity, comets have been associated with death, with national disasters. We'll talk a little bit about that with Halley's comet in a second. When there's a lot of not only comets, but meteor showers in the early to mid 19th century, these are seen as signs of the approaching Civil War. Just to give a few examples, Nat Turner, the famous slave in Southern Virginia, he sees a solar eclipse on February 12, 1831, as a sign to start his uprising. That same year, there's a very large meteor shower that's visible in Richmond, Virginia. There's a slave at the time named John Jasper who sees that meteor shower. That's one of the things that inspires him to get into preaching. Relevant to my interests, in the late 19th century, John Jasper will become the leading flat Earth proponent not only in the United States, arguably in the world at the time. A few years later, as a young man, Abraham Lincoln in 1833 sees the Leonid meteor shower. He writes about how his companions at the time think this is an approaching sign of the end of the world, but because the Leonids that are caused by the tails of comets that the Earth regularly passes through, Lincoln says that because the Earth passes through the Leonids every year, it's not a sign of the end of the world, but the continuation of the world. And he writes during the Civil War, he sees the regular passage of the Leonids as a sign that the country itself is going to survive. Harriet Tubman also viewed the Leonid meteor shower while still a slave before escaping. She writes that other slaves thought it was a sign of the end of the world, even though she didn't. Likewise, Frederick Douglass writes about the Leonid shower being associated not with the end of the world, but with the second coming. Now, in July 1860, there's meteor showers that are seen that people believe are signs of the approaching Civil War. The Great Comet of 1860, which had been visible since the fall of 1859, are linked to Harper's Ferry by a number of notable figures: Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, Herman Melville. A year later, there's another great comet that's extremely visible in the sky that comes in July 1861, 3 years after the start of the Civil War, which is seen as a symbol of the outbreak of the war. Now, 10 years after the start of the war, in 1871, there are huge wildfires that spread across the Midwest. Again, maybe some things don't change. People at the time believed that the fires are caused by the collision on Earth by a fragment of a comet called Biela's comet that had passed in 1852. Now, the idea that Biela's comet had come back and hit and caused the wildfires, that wasn't the case. But the idea that comet impacts could cause these massive natural disasters start to get picked up by works of fiction. One of the kind of early science fiction uses of comet is Jules Verne's 1877 novel Hector Servadac, which helpfully gets retitled Off on a Comet in English translations. Jules Verne had written From the Earth to the Moon in 1865. He wrote Around the Moon in 1870. So this is kind of the next in his stories about outer space exploration. In this novel, the comet Gallia, which is fictional, has a near impact in the Western Mediterranean. As a result, a lot of people in the Western Mediterranean on boats are taken up onto the comet, which has an oceanic surface. So using this Russian ship, the French characters are able to sail around the comet. They encounter these small pockets of other survivors that have been taken up onto the comet. In the novel, 2 years after its initial brush with Earth, Gallia again nears the planet. The human inhabitants build a balloon out of the sails of the ship, and as the comet touches Earth's atmosphere, they kind of float back down to the mother planet. There's a science fiction author named Stephen Baxter, who also for a time was head of the H.G. Wells Society. He has called Off on a Comet the first vision of a human community surviving in a small, self-sustaining, Earth-like environment far from Earth itself. Now, another follow-up to From the Earth to the Moon was a serialized novel from 1869 to 70 called The Brick Moon, published by Edward Everett Hale. He was a Unitarian minister from Boston, grandnephew of Nathan Hale. He had served as the chaplain of the U.S. Senate from 1903 up until his death in 1909. Hale's story involves the construction of the titular space station, the Brick Moon. It's accidentally launched into space with people still on it. the inhabitants of the brick moon kind of form this small society on this artificial satellite. Again, Stephen Baxter's called The Brick Moon probably the first fictional depiction of a manned space station, and it's the longest work about a satellite of any sort until 1952. Also, the brick moon is meant to aid communication, so this is technically the first appearance in fiction or in nonfiction of the concept of the communications satellite. Now, notably, Mark Twain met Hale on December 7th, 1906. They're both speaking to the U.S. House of Representatives about copyright issues. So Twain knew about Hale definitely when he was told by a reporter about Hale's death in 1909. Twain responded by stating he had the greatest respect for the man, the greatest admiration for his work. So I haven't found any smoking gun that Twain did read The Brick Moon, but it seems very likely he did. Another work, we'll say, bridging the gap between fiction and nonfiction related to comets is the 1883 nonfiction book RAGNAROK by a figure named Ignatius Donnelly, who's I think he's been termed the Prince of the Cranks in the 19th century. But he has a very interesting career. You could have a whole conference just on him. He starts as a radical Republican politician in Minnesota. He's elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He's elected lieutenant governor of Minnesota. After the end of Reconstruction, he kind of loses faith. He joins to become one of the leaders of the Populist Party. He's a strong advocate for black enfranchisement, for the rights of women, for education. But in 1802, he starts exploring a different career, I guess we can say conspiracy theorist. He publishes in 1882 the book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which is basically reviving Plato's theory. The reason why we talk about Atlantis so much today, it stems directly from his 1882 book, which is hugely influential. William Gladstone, Charles Darwin write to him about it. So again, this is being read by major figures, and notably is probably influenced by Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where they visit Atlantis. Inspired by this, in less than 6 months, he writes a over 400-page sequel and publishes it, called Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, where he proposes that a comet impact had not only been what destroyed Atlantis, but that a comet impact had caused mass extinctions across the world and destroyed civilizations. Obviously, that's not exactly correct, and he's a major influence on 20th century conspiracy theorists like Velikovsky and Graham Hancock. So you can see this as kind of the start of a major aspect of modern, like, doomsday conspiracy views. But at the same time, his proposal anticipates the 1980 Alvarez hypothesis of dinosaur extinction. He's the first one to suggest that there could be major permanent biological and environmental changes on Earth from a comet impact. Carl Sagan, did give him credit as being the first person to create this idea. So again, we see something that bridges both kind of nonfiction, but actually very fictional views of the past and the change. Now, bring it back here. We have Mark Twain, his 3 views of comets. First one, A Curious Pleasure Excursion, was written during the summer of 1874 when a comet named the comet Gallia passes Earth. This causes a minor panic at the time because in 1874, for the first time, astronomers using the new invention of the spectrograph, which allows you to see chemical elements in distant celestial bodies, they look at Gallia's tail and they find traces of cyanogen, which obviously is a very deadly gas. So there's a minor panic around the discovery of cyanogen in Gallia's tail, but it's not too widespread. But A Curious Pleasure Excursion is basically Mark Twain writing about how he and P.T. Barnum have bought Gallia, are commissioning pleasure cruises leaving from New York City to go on the comet. They'll return in the year 1999. It's just basically talking about the comet as basically as a giant ocean liner. It's a short story. It's funny, but interestingly, there is a possible reference to Edward Everett Hale of the Brick Moon fame. The guy who runs the postal service on the comet is a guy named Mr. Hale of Maine. So again, it seems to be a connection. There is a lot of kind of similarities there as well to Jules Verne's novel Propeller Island, which is about a giant artificial, like miles-long pleasure cruise ship going around the Pacific Ocean. That comes after A Curious Pleasure Excursion, so it's possible Jules Verne read this and kind of incorporated some of those ideas into his future novel. Now we have, A Letter from the Comet, which again is this abandoned minor story, but again, a minor reference, again, a letter from the comet to Earth, talking about his views of evolution, change on the Earth every time he comes back around. Again, incorporating Twain's interest not only in what we would today call deep space, but also deep time and comparisons of that. And then one of his last works, Captain Stormfield's Visit to Heaven. There's a comet racing segment in there where he anticipates that the dead souls of people, are comets or become comets when they go into space. If I'm remembering right, it's Proxima Centauri, the nearest star to Earth, that Mark Twain is very interested in kind of doing this fanciful calculation where if, comets have a certain speed and Proxima Centauri is heaven, then Mark Twain near the end of his life tries to calculate how fast a soul would take to get to heaven. So again, we have some interesting adaptations of astronomical works with religious views or irreligious views, such as they may be for Mark Twain. But again, near the end of his life in 1910, we have Halley's Comet approaching as well. 1910, the comet is given a much larger role in the public as opposed to 1835. There's a lot happening in 1910. In Britain, there's a major political crisis over the Liberal Party's reform programs, which again, I don't have time to get into. It's merely forgotten now. But at the time, this is seen as, is Britain going to break apart? Again, some things don't go away. But in the midst of this, giant political upheaval, not only is Halley's Comet returning, but actually King Edward VII dies on the day of Halley's Comet's closest approach to Earth. In China, fear over Halley's Comet returning leads to the revolution that overthrows the Qing dynasty and institutes the Republic of China. So again, you have the comet being linked to these massive political upheavals on Earth, but more, in more widespread. This is when the fear over cyanogen in the comet's tail comes full bore. Not only are scientists determining that there is cyanogen in Halley's Comet's tail, but unlike with Comet Kaja, the Earth is going to pass through the tail of Halley's Comet. So you have things of this widespread fear over people, buying gas masks, trying to build shelters, underground. There are reports of people killing themselves because they're afraid that, they'd rather die first than die from cyanogen poisoning. This is a clear predecessor of kind of some of the panics that are going to emerge later on with, for example, the War of the Worlds broadcast in 1938, but also the Hale-Bopp suicides, again, comet-related at the other end of the century. I suspect, again, I haven't done enough research into this, I suspect the panic over the gas in Halley's Comet's tail leads into the public perception of poison gas that emerges in World War I a few years later. Again, I haven't found any smoking guns, so to speak, but I suspect a lot of the view of gas warfare has to be building off of this as well. And so again, we have these literary predecessors to the gas panic as well. M.P. Scheel writes The Purple Cloud in 1901. H.G. Wells writes In the Days of the Comet in 1906. These are both stories kind of building off the earlier gas panics around comets in the 1870s. They're about, the Earth passing through these gas clouds in space. But the memories of this panic are actually reflected even in authors coming later. Arthur Conan Doyle's 1913 novel, The Poison Belt. It's about a band of ether in space, but again, very clearly reflecting the gas panic. W.E.B. Du Bois writes a short story in 1920, The Comet, where again, a comet passes by Earth. It seemingly kills everyone in New York City except for a black man and a white woman. He directly references the Halley's Comet panic in that kind of very early post-apocalyptic story. So again, a lot which is going on, besides the fact that, Twain predicts he's going to die when Halley's Comet passes, and it turns out he actually does as well. Let me just to pass up very quick, I'm almost out of time. Twain also lives in a period of extreme discoveries of new bodies in the solar system. The planet Neptune is discovered in 1846. The first new moons of Jupiter since Galileo's time are discovered starting in 1892. There's the belief that there's another planet orbiting within the orbit of Mercury named Vulcan. There's a planet who's hypothesized of being destroyed and causing the asteroid belt called Phaeton. And there's a search for a planet beyond Neptune called Planet X. Mark Twain is interested in all of these discoveries, and he's particularly interested in the attempts to find Planet X. Very near the end of his life, January 30th, 1909, he publishes a short article called The New Planet on efforts to find Planet X. Planet X is eventually going to be discovered in 1930 as the planet Pluto, named partly after the astronomer who starts the search for it, Percival Lowell. Percival Lowell looks for Planet X because he has been discredited for his promotion of the Martian Canal hypothesis in the late 1890s, early 1910s. The idea that astronomers could discover these giant public works programs on Mars, the canals, which again turn out not to be the case, but Lowell becomes very popular during that. Again, I haven't seen any evidence Twain writes about Martian canals, but he had to have heard of them at the time. And then the last thing I'll say is, much like today we have in Congress debates over UFOs, there are multiple UFO panics in Mark Twain's life, 1896 to 97, and then 1909 to 1910. There are fears over what are called mystery airships. These are not associated with aliens. They're associated more so with crazy inventors creating these airships. But again, they're very similar to the basis of what we consider UFOs today. And considering Mark Twain's views on politicians, you have to wonder what he would think not only of Congress people seriously debating this, but also the fact that multiple people involved with this in Congress have appeared on the Ancient Aliens TV show. That's a whole other can of worms, what Twain would think of that. But I'll end that here. And again, thank you for letting me ramble on for 20 minutes.